Now that I've got my test block all pieced together and I know that my cutting instructions were correct and all that math was right, I have my green pieces ready to go, my background fabric ready to go, and I also went through and just sort of summarized my cutting instructions so they were a lot more clear. Trying to work from your initial fabric requirement instructions that you might have written out for that math isn't exactly the clearest thing that you can follow when you go to cut what you need for your quilt. As we go through this particular video, I am going to be using my rotary blade and ruler and a cutting mat. And if you have those tools available to you, but you haven't tried any cutting shortcut techniques yet, I will be doing those as I prep my fabric for piecing. So you can follow along and give some of them a try yourself. The first thing that you need to do when you're working from fabric that's being cut off the bolt or yardage is to make sure that you square up that first raw edge. As long as you have folded your fabric well in half and pressed everything out, you can line up on your ruler the bottom edge and treat it as if it were a straight line. And usually some part of your selvage edge at the top, while not completely straight, is going to be very close, and it's going to let you know that you're generally doing okay with what you need to straighten off your first cut. When I'm using a really long ruler like this one, I do find it difficult to hold my ruler in place without it slipping, and so I like to use a weight on top of it, and it just helps keep it that much more secure. So everything's lined up, and I am ready to trim off that bit. So now I have a nice clean straight edge here, and I'm going to flip my fabric around so my straight edge is now on the other side. And I'm going to start measuring off my first cuts for the fabric. So I've got my green cutting instructions, and for the large square I need to cut 2 strips with the fabric. So remember, with the fabric is the distance in between your 2 selvage edges over here. So right now my width of fabric is folded in half, so it fits on my cutting mat and fully underneath my ruler. So that first step is to cut 2 5.5-inch strips, and just like before when I lined up against the folded edge, I'm going to start there, and I'm also going to make sure my 5.5-inch line is good all the way up to the top. So if I'm straight along here and the bottom, I know that I'm going to be cutting a straight line, and my strip is going to be even all the way through. So that is cut 1. Slide this off, and I will do that one more time and just double checking that I'm at the 5.5-inch mark, and I'm still working with a straight fold, and my 5.5-inch line is also lined up and straight. So my second strip is cut. And then my next one is 1 3-inch width of fabric. I've checked my lines and everything is still looking pretty good. I'm starting to get off slightly. So the next time that I cut into this, I will need to square everything up again. And you might find that you need to do that more than once while you're cutting out your strips. But that's all I need from this piece of fabric here. So let's take a look now at our first method of kind of being more efficient with our cutting. And I had previously mentioned the idea of stacking your fabric and making multiple cuts at one time. So here I've got my 2 5.5-inch strips stacked on top of each other. I'm making sure everything is well lined up, and that's sort of the key to this. It does need to be lined up very well. Then I need to remove my selvage edge, and you want to check when you're cutting these that you are removing enough of your end here, that if your fabric wasn't folded exactly in half, so one side is just a little bit higher up than the other, that you're going to get both sides of that edge cut off. And just run your blade through it. The more fabric you cut, you want to make sure that your blade is nice and sharp. And then I can turn these, and I'm leaving everything folded in half because right now there are 4 layers of fabric here stacked, which means that every time I make a cut, I am getting 4 of my 5.5-inch squares. So this is where you definitely want to make sure when you're cutting that you are double checking your math every single time. Because if you make a mistake, that's 4 pieces that are not the correct size. So efficient, but more risk involved. One method that you can do to help reduce that risk, because you're cutting them all the same, is you can put a piece of tape along that 5.5-inch line to help you make sure that you don't cut at the wrong measurement. So sometimes, you know, those little tricks are helpful and they can reduce that risk when you're working on being more efficient. For me though, I just check from the top and the bottom that I'm on the 5.5-inch spot. So I find the 5.5 on this from the bottom, I go up and I take a look one more time at it from the top down to where I'm at, and then making sure that everything else is nicely in line here. And so now this next part, I do need to open these up because my next 5.5-inch cut is going to be over where the fabric was folded in half. And I just need to kind of realign everything. As I place my ruler over top of this, I do want to just make sure everything's smoothed out. And then the ruler is usually pretty good at just pushing the whole thing flat without changing, or like without distorting your fabric. So you will want to make sure though, that one more double check that both pieces of fabric are in fact lined up. Once you've verified that, go ahead and cut that last 5.5 inch bolt. So this one, when I get back to where my iron is, I am going to just press this down so it remains flat. You might find it easier when you're cutting to press this out flat first. It's up to you. I'm just not nearby where my iron is to have done that before making this cut. So my 3-inch piece here, I'm just going to set this aside and save it for when I can stack more of these on top of each other, seeing as how I only have one and it's just more time efficient to set these and cut my sub cuts a little bit later. So I'm about ready to straighten up on my second fabric option. Some prints are really challenging when they've got a very clear geometric repeat, and these prints don't always make it onto fabric straight. And you've got a couple of options if you are particular about wanting it to be straight. As far as the print goes, you can cut your fabric to the print. There is a term for that. It's called fussy cutting. And you also have the option to not, and just work on keeping the fabric cuts straight to the fold and not worrying about whether the print is, the straightest. And depending on what you're doing with it, how straight that print is might not actually be critical to the whole overall design of what you're making anyway. So I need 2 5.5 inch cuts, and it's always easier to do these from this with the fabric, because your fabric begins and ends so much closer to the 5.5 inch mark. And let's go over subcutting these pieces. So for here, what you want to line up when you're cleaning up your one edge is along your selvage edge. We have talked a little bit in the past about different fabrics, different manufacturers and lines not being exactly identical in their size. And so having my selvage ends lined up here, my fold is just a little bit, the one is just a little bit bigger than the other fabric. So you want to make sure, especially if you're interested in conserving as much fabric as you can, start by cutting up or matching to your selvage edge and then cutting off from there. And that fabric that is just a tiny bit longer, you are going to have just a little bit more left over from it than the other one that was just a little bit smaller. And now I can subcut these two strips into by 3 inches, and I will have the 3-inch squares that I need. And for this last one, I chose to turn it over because it is a little bit smaller. So I do want to make sure that I can, in fact, cut a 3-inch piece out of it. So all that's left of those two is just this tiny, about 1/2 inch and almost 1/2 inch bit. Now I am fairly confident that I have one more cut of these squares than I need for all the blocks for my quilt. And the seam, I believe, goes for my larger 5.5 inch squares. Sometimes when I'm just subcutting things, if there's going to be an extra block or two, I just make them up anyway. And they can go into a kind of a random quilt if you want later on. Or if something doesn't go right and maybe you've, unstitched a block or piece too many times and it just ends up destroyed, then you've already got an extra piece ready to go to remake that block. So I am going to leave some of my 3-inch strips without subcutting them. the way that my block is assembled with the smaller pieces, I can use a method called strip piecing because I need a small background block and a small green block together. And when I sew these pieces together in one long strip, it is a lot faster to do that than it is to sew small squares together and press them open. Once I have the strips sewn together, then I can go ahead and subcut those pieces all together. So I have 3 colors that are left that I didn't subcut into 3-inch blocks. So I need 3 or a total of 5 black strips as well in 5-inch piece or of these 3-inch pieces. So I'm going to leave 3 of them uncut so that way in week 4, when we're going through piecing that quilt together, then we can go over that strip piecing technique for this particular block. I have the fabric chosen for my large block or 3x3 thirds divided square. And I'm going to start with cutting the dark fabric pieces first, and then I will move on to the light pieces. One of the nice things about this block, the fabric requirements were definitely harder to calculate. However, because it's all kind of strips of the same size, when I go to cut, everything is actually much simpler in that aspect. So almost everything I'm doing here is going to come off in 3.5-inch strips. Because of the number of 3.5-inch strips that I need to cut from the dark fabric, I need 8 of my dark blue and dark pinks. I have decided that I'm going to fold my fabric over in half so that way when I'm subcutting 2 strips at a time. So in preparation for that, I was very careful about ironing out my fabric, making sure that everything was really going to lay and line up nice and flat. So I'm going to start off by trimming off the extra bits of ends so everything is nice and square. And I am going to treat the folded line, that halfway point on with the fabric, as the straight line. And then because I'm going through quite a bit of fabric and this ruler is very long, I'm using a weight to help hold everything securely in place. And of course checking to make sure that I don't have bits of fabric that are going to miss being cut off when I'm squaring this up. So that's better. So you can see that I was very close right there at the top. There was, you can see the unevenness of the fabric. So I am going to just double check that I didn't miss anything at the top, and that I'm not going to have a bit that is shorter, and it all looks good. And just double check everything is lined up, smooth out. And now I can measure out my 3.5-inch width, making sure that not only does that bottom fold line up, but so does my fabric here, that cut at the top. So that gives me 2 of my dark blue strips. I need 8 of these.